Good morning. This is John H. Irwin with the Hot Spring County Historical Society. And today I'm going to relate a tale. It was an article. It was written by my brother Lewis P. Irwin just before he passed away on September 14th of 1982. And it's called Memories from Across the River. Lewis spent a lot of boyhood years there, and he recollected several things that happened when he was living there with our grandparents. And he starts by saying, my family lived on Baker Hill in my boyhood years. I was born in a large house built by Dr. Henry C. Baker, from whom Baker Hill was named. This area is now called North Malvern. The Baker house was recently raised to accommodate the new Highway 270 cutoff. My father and his brother-in-law, Walter Woodall, who married my mother's sister, co-rented the house. It was a huge house with a large hall down the center. My father and mother lived in one side of the hall, and Uncle Walter Woodall in the rooms on the other side. My father, Samuel R. Bob Irwin, rented various houses on Baker Hill until about 1913, when he bought a lot on the corner of Elmo Street and Baker Street and built his own house. My grandparents, N.B. and Sarah K. Irwin, lived on the west side of the Ouachita River across from Old Rockport. They made their living by farming, selling timber, and so forth. My grandfather was also a justice of the peace for a period of time. When my father decided to pay his parents a visit, he would get the family together and tell them that we were going across the river, and so we'd load up in the old T-model sedan and take off. My earliest recollection of across the river began about the year 1910. It was then that I moved in with my grandparents, and there I spent about 15 years of my youth. I shall try to recall happenings and people of that era in this article. Those years contain memories that are unforgettable. The area across the river is described in this manner. Take a 4-mile radius with its center at the west end of the Rockport Bridge, and draw an imaginary semicircle from the west bank of the Ouachita below the bridge, then swing it around to the west bank above the bridge. It was approximately in this area that I spent most of my boyhood. I can remember the people and many of the tales which they handed down through the years and through several generations. These stories must be true, for they have been verified from several different sources. The people. I have learned from different sources the names of many families that settled across the river in the early years. Some of the earliest settlers were the Fenners, Physicks, Millers, Floyds, Cantrells, Grigsbys, and Daniels. Later, in the middle 1860s, came the Irwins, the Beechams, Hefords, and Burrises, and after this came the Hathcock and Millard Smith families, and others I cannot recall just now. I attended church and school with some of the descendants of the above-mentioned families. The children I grew up there with were Spears, Beecham, Smith, Grigsbys, Haltons, McEwen, Birches, and Reeds. Located far up the river near the Nares Mountain was an isolated family named Four Lines. Many other families moved into the area, lived there for a while, and then moved on to greener pastures. There was a settlement of blacks about 3 or 4 miles out from the bridge on what is now Highway 84. This community was known as Dove Hill, and the families were descendants of freed slaves. They had their own church and cemetery there, and both have long since vanished, with hardly a sign of their existence. There were 2 schools that served the educational needs of families living in the area across the river. These were the Shady Grove School and the Brawley School. The Brawley School was situated outside the 4-mile radius, but Shady Grove was close in and built of rough lumber. It was situated about a mile from any road that existed at that time. The location was the only logical place central to all the families in the area. Many footpaths were beaten through the woods and along the old rail fences. They came into the school from all directions. Later, in about the mid-20s, a new school was built on Highway 84. It, too, has vanished with the old Shady Grove and the Brawley schools, and has joined them only in fond memories. I first attended Shady Grove about 1911. Clara Halton was my first teacher. At the time of this writing, she is about 93 years old, of age, and lived in Little Rock. My first textbook was a toy child's book that I had received as a Christmas present. When I graduated from that, I was given a primer. My school teacher in the second grade was Emmett Luton. It was to him that I made my first smart aleck remark. He asked me if I knew the population of Brazil, and my answer was, I don't know, I never did count them. He then gave me the answer, and I was ordered to write on the blackboard the following. The population of Brazil is 2 million people. After writing that several times, the population stuck in my memory, and I never forgot it. After 2 terms in Shady Grove School, I transferred to the Rockport School. I claim the honor of walking across the Rockport Bridge more than any person alive today. There were 2 churches in that area. Most of the people across the river attended the Rockport Methodist Church. My grandfather was affiliated with this congregation for more than 50 years and was one of the leaders of the church. He was known among his neighbors as Tobe Irwin. Before a bridge was built across the Washita at Rockport, people either forded the river or crossed on a ferry. Afterwards, a wooden bridge was constructed there by the Washita Falls Lumber Company. It was a toll bridge. I have an old letter written to a friend from my father dated January 7, 1900, explaining why he couldn't keep a date at a church function. Someone had stolen his boat. Later in that year, the Rockport Bridge was constructed. Another church was located about 5 to 7 miles on what is now Highway 171. They did not have regular services, but had occasional meetings, singing, and dinner on the ground. Some of the ministers I remember at Rockport Church were Brother Jack Taylor, Roy Jordan, Brother Fuller, and the Reverend M.E. Scott, who was still with us in Malvern. The people over there were good neighbors, and usually were very helpful to one another and kept in touch with all their neighbors. One great help was a rural telephone line that served the area. It was a single line. My grandparents had a telephone. It was the old wall type with a hand crank for ringing. Each telephone had a certain number of rings, 1 ring, 2 rings, or so forth. I believe my grandmother's phone had a number of 4 rings. Every time she received a call and picked up the receiver, she could hear the neighbors picking up receivers all up and down the line. They wanted to hear what was going on. She didn't mind, for she did the same thing when someone else got a call. That was one way for people to keep in touch. The neighbors were always willing to lend a helping hand in case of sickness or death in the family. If the head of the family was incapacitated by sickness or accident, the neighbors would help by plowing, cultivating, or gathering his crops. Most all the people across the river had small farms in those days. They helped each other during hog killing time. The hogs would run in the hill most of the time, being rounded up and penned in the late fall for fattening up. Each family had an earmark for their hogs. Cattle were raised in the same manner. Each family in the area had a different function. The dipping vat for cattle was on Mr. Haltom's property. The Irwins had a sorghum mill and cooking equipment. My Uncle Nat Irwin could make sorghum molasses any way you wanted it. Light, dark, heavy, or thin and syrupy. Sorghum molasses and butter and hot biscuits were a stable breakfast. Add it to a thick slice of home-cured ham and a generous sopping of red-eye gravy, and you had a breakfast that would really stick to your ribs. My grandfather also owned a complete blacksmith shop, and many neighbors brought smith work over there for him to do. Mr. Millard Smith owned a sawmill, and farther west of his place, the Burris family operated both a sawmill and a grist mill. And they would grind your meal from corn on a toll basis. Take so much of the corn for their toll and grind the rest up for your cornmeal. Mr. Smith also specialized in coffin making, often performing this service without any charge at all. The neighbors also saw to it that a grave was dug for a bereaved family. Most everyone could be depended on in a time of need. Other facts of the story are these. Now, everyone knows about the falls on the Ouachita River. Just below the falls was a sort of a beach, a sandbar. This was a favorite swimming place and was also used for baptizing years ago in the early 1900s. There was also a clubhouse there during those years, the Ouachita Country Club. And it was had running water, which was drawn from the river by use of a gasoline engine. I believe it was built by Coulter Butler. Adjoining the clubhouse was a picnic area with tables. On this same spot in the 1880s, there was a lumber camp and a terminus for the tram road from the west part of that region. Logs were hauled in here by rail and dumped, and then floated about a mile down the river to the Ouachita Falls Lumber Company. There was also a sawmill on the Bayou de Chute about 2 miles past the old Millard Smith house, and later it was moved to about where the I-30 bridge is now. Bayou de Chute empties into the Ouachita in a place above the falls and runs through a valley parallel to Highway 171 to the state park on Lake Catherine. In the year 1919, there was a tragedy above the falls. John Earl Rogers was drowned early one July morning about a mile from the falls. Men worked all day searching the river for the body. They exploded charges of dynamite in the river, trying to make the body float. His mother, Mrs. Tom Radford Rogers, stood all day on a small peninsula jutting out into the river while the men conducted the long search. At nightfall, they gave up. That very night, fate played a strange role. John Earl's body floated and was lodged on that same peninsula where his mother had spent such a long, sad, and lonely vigil. Near the old Shady Grove School, there was a large bluff over a creek. The Florence children were washing clothes in the creek. Mrs. Floyd came to the top of the bluff to call the children. Her foot slipped, and she fell to her death on the rock below. To this day, the precipice is known as Floyd's Rock. Below my grandfather's house, there was a dogwood tree about 100 yards into the woods from the road. A Mr. Starks came in from town daily and left my grandfather's mail and the Daily Arkansas Gazette in that tree, snuggled in a place where the limbs of the tree made a fork. it was my chore to go down 1/2 mile through the woods to retrieve the mail and the newspaper. About 1913, the rural free delivery was established, and I lost my job. Mr. Hathcock, who lived in that settlement, was a fine gentleman who had moved there in about 1892. He was a Methodist and joined with the Rockport Methodist congregation. My father and Uncle Nat also attended church there. These boys conceived an idea of a practical joke to play on Mr. Hathcock. After the early Sunday morning school was over, they left and set up the joke. They had prepared a large jug with a long string attached to the handle of the jug. About 200 yards west of the bridge was a small swamp in the field across the road from the river. The road was always wet or extremely dusty next to the swamp. They chose a very dry day when the road was covered with about 4 inches of dry dust. They watched for Mr. Hathcock and his horse, and just before he came into sight, they pulled the jug across the dust in a crooked, winding pattern. Mr. Hathcock saw this huge snake track and hurried home. He got his loaded shotgun, aroused the neighbors, and he took off to find a large snake to either kill or capture the reptile. In conclusion, I am very grateful to Mr. Silas Smith, Sr. for refreshing my memories and some of the information I needed to write this article. Mr. Smith is the last old-timer left across the river and is the only surviving member of the original Millard Smith family and was a very successful farmer. I am also grateful to Miss Neely Burns, the daughter of Mr. Hathcock. She also furnished me with some of the information I've written in this article. About the only familiar scenes of my years across the river can be seen on what is now called Smith Loop. My grandfather's old homestead burned to the ground long ago, and many old-time relics, such as the old spinning wheel, the old high wheel bicycle, and many old letters, photographs, and so forth were destroyed. The ruins of the old blacksmith shop are still evident, and near the old shop is a spot of ground where you can feel warmth in the coldest winter. Winter snows always melt on that spot of ground. It makes one wonder what is underneath the ground there. Now this concludes my brother Lewis P. Irwin's article on the years across the river. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I thank you very much for listening to it. This is Henry Irwin with the Hot Spring County Historical Society, and this article has been published in our Heritage, volume number 9, for the year 1982, along with many other interesting articles and family photos and such. I thank you very much.